$10 says she quits before the end of week 1. The voice carried across the staging area, low enough to seem private, but loud enough that Kira Brennan heard every word. She kept her eyes forward, adjusting the straps on her tactical vest with steady hands, while 3 male trainees stood 15 feet away, their conversation continuing as if she were invisible. 20 says she doesn't make it past the surrounded scenario. The second voice held more certainty, almost bored with how obvious the outcomes seemed. That's when people find out what they're really made of. She won't last 10 minutes once the pressure's on. The morning sun beat down on Fort Bragg's training grounds, turning the red clay beneath their boots into dust that hung in the air with each movement. Kira checked her rifle for the 4th time, finding the same perfect condition it had been in moments before, but the motion gave her hands something to do while her mind cataloged every dismissive word, every assumption being made about her capabilities. Master Chief Dalton approached with his ever-present clipboard, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism that came from watching hundreds of candidates fail the Advanced Tactical Operations course. He stopped directly in front of her position, close enough that the other trainees turned to watch the interaction, their betting conversation pausing with obvious interest. Brennan. His tone suggested he was already tired of saying her name. You understand the attrition rate for this course is 81%, even among candidates with extensive combat experience. His pale blue eyes swept over her frame with the kind of assessment that found her lacking before she even opened her mouth. Most people who wash out do so in the first 3 weeks, usually during the surrounded scenario exercise. Yes, Master Chief. Her voice remained level, professional, giving him nothing to criticize in her bearing, even as she felt the weight of 17 pairs of eyes watching this exchange. He waited, his silence an obvious invitation for her to take the exit he was offering, his clipboard already angled, as if preparing to make a notation about her withdrawal. The 3 trainees who'd been betting leaned forward slightly, their body language radiating certainty that they were about to collect on their wagers before weeks and even arrived. I'm ready for the challenge, Master Chief. She met his gaze directly, keeping her shoulders square despite every instinct that screamed about the judgment radiating from every person within sight. His expression shifted into something that might have been resignation or disappointment. We'll see. The clipboard lowered, and he moved down the line to the next candidate, a broad-shouldered man named Torres who received a nod of acknowledgement that Kira had not earned. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to connect with all of you watching. Drop a comment and let me know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed situations like this in military communities where you live, where someone faced out before they had a chance to prove themselves. Your perspective matters here. The formation began moving toward the morning briefing area, boots striking packed earth in an uneven rhythm as candidates arranged themselves in the predetermined order that placed Kira at the rear. She caught fragments of continued conversation from the group ahead, their voices carrying in the still morning air with the kind of carelessness that came from believing she couldn't hear or simply not caring if she did. Look at her gear setup. The observation came from a tall trainee with sergeant stripes whose name tape read Vickers. Completely standard issue. No personal modifications, no customization. She's never operated outside a training environment. His companion, a compact man with a shaved head called Russo, glanced back over his shoulder with unconcealed assessment. My money says she freezes during first contact. Surrounded scenario is going to eat her alive. When you've got threats from multiple directions and limited cover, that's when you find out if someone actually has combat instincts or if they just look good on the range. The briefing area consisted of covered bleachers facing a large topographical map board that showed the training complex's varied terrain. Kira took a seat in the back row, her rifle held across her lap in the prescribed manner, while other candidates filled in around her, most choosing positions that created a noticeable buffer of empty space on either side of where she sat. Lieutenant Commander Hayes strode to the front, his crisp uniform and rigid posture marking him as someone who'd spent decades in special operations before accepting this instructor position. His dark eyes scanned the assembled candidates with the kind of penetrating assessment that seemed to see through whatever facades people tried to present. "Welcome to week 1 of Advanced Tactical Operations." His voice carried authority that came from experience rather than volume. 81% of you will not complete this course. Most will fail during our signature exercise, the surrounded scenario, which you'll face at the end of this week. In this scenario, you'll be placed in hostile territory with limited intelligence, inadequate cover, and threats approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously. He tapped the map board, highlighting a section of dense woodland interspersed with small clearings. Your ability to maintain situational awareness, make rapid tactical decisions, and execute effective countermeasures under extreme pressure will determine whether you succeed or join the majority who prove unready for this level of operations. Kira studied the terrain features while around her. Candidates shifted with varying degrees of confidence or anxiety. She caught Vickers leaning toward Rousseau, his whispered comment barely audible but clear enough in her proximity. "She won't make it past day 3. The surrounded scenario requires instincts you can't teach. Either you have them or you don't, and everything about her screams book learning with no real-world application." Hayes continued his briefing, detailing the week's training progression that would culminate in the surrounded scenario, but Kira found her attention divided between his instructions and the continued quiet assessment happening throughout the bleachers. Master Chief Dalton stood to the side of the briefing area, his arms crossed, and his expression suggesting he'd already calculated who would succeed and who would fail, and her position in his mental tally seemed fixed firmly in the latter category. When the briefing concluded, candidates rose and began moving toward their assigned training stations. Kira followed the flow, maintaining proper spacing and bearing while her mind worked through what she'd observed in the past hour. Every assumption being made about her capabilities, every dismissive comment and skeptical look, every prediction of her failure, they all created a picture of expectations so low that meeting them would require almost nothing, which meant exceeding them, truly proving what she could do when it mattered, would require everything. The first training station focused on close quarters movement, a confined space marked by plywood walls that simulated urban structures with narrow corridors and blind corners. Kira watched as candidates ahead of her moved through the course in pairs, their movements critiqued by Sergeant First Class Monroe, a compact woman with sharp eyes who'd spent 15 years in special operations before rotating into instruction. "Brennan, you're up with Torres." Monroe's voice carried no particular warmth or hostility, just the flat professionalism of someone who'd learned not to invest emotion in candidates who'd likely be gone within days. "Show me how you clear a room when you don't know what's waiting on the other side." Torres moved to the entry point without acknowledging Kira's presence beside him, his rifle already positioned for immediate engagement as they approached the first blind corner. She maintained proper spacing, her movements textbook correct as they flowed through the initial sequence. But Torres cleared each space as if working alone, his body language radiating the assumption that she'd be more liability than asset if contact actually occurred. "Hold!" Monroe's command stopped them at the third corridor junction. "Torres, your partner positioning is completely wrong. You're moving like she doesn't exist, which means you're leaving sectors uncovered and creating gaps that would get you both killed in actual engagement." Torres glanced at Kira with poorly concealed frustration, as if Monroe's critique was somehow her fault rather than his failure to acknowledge her as a functional team member. They reset and continued, but his movements remained unchanged, his trust in her capabilities clearly non-existent despite the instructor's direct feedback. When they completed the course, Monroe gathered the assembled candidates for her assessment. "Most of you are moving through these spaces like you're alone, which tells me you don't actually trust your teammates to cover their sectors." She gestured toward the plywood structure. "In a real scenario, that lack of trust gets people killed." "Torres, run it again with Vickers." "Brennan, you're with Rousseau." Rousseau's expression showed exactly what he thought about this pairing, his jaw tightening as he moved to the entry point where Kira waited. She caught his muttered comment to Vickers as they passed each other. "Great. Babysitting duty. They entered the course, and Russo's movements held the same dismissive quality Torres had demonstrated, clearing spaces without any real coordination or acknowledgement of her positioning. Kira maintained her sectors, covered her angles, moved with precision that would have been effective with a partner who actually trusted her capabilities. But Russo treated her like a training dummy placed in the course to add complexity rather than a fellow operator. The morning progressed through various stations, each one revealing the same pattern of dismissal and low expectations. During marksmanship drills, she noticed Vickers and another trainee named Chun standing near the ammunition supply, their conversation carrying across the range with careless volume. Check out her stance. Vickers gestured toward where Kira prepared for her shooting sequence. Completely by the book. Zero adaptation, zero personal optimization. She shoots like someone who learned from a manual and never actually had to engage moving targets under pressure. Chin nodded, loading his own magazines with practiced efficiency. The surrounded scenario is going to expose that hard. When you've got multiple threats and limited time, textbook responses get you killed. You need instincts, muscle memory from actual combat, not classroom theory. Kira settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and proceeded to place 18 rounds through the center mass of targets at varying distances, her groupings tight enough that Monroe paused in her supervision of another candidate to watch the final sequence. When Kira cleared her weapon and stepped back from the line, Monroe's expression showed something that might have been surprise, quickly suppressed back into professional neutrality. Adequate. Monroe marked something on her evaluation sheet before moving down the line. Brennan, you're up on the stress shoot next rotation. The stress shoot involved moving through obstacles while engaging targets that appeared at random intervals, designed to simulate the chaos and unpredictability of actual combat. Kira watched 3 candidates attempt the course before her turn arrived, noting how each one struggled with target acquisition when physical exertion compromised their fine motor control and breathing. When her turn came, Master Chief Dalton appeared at the edge of the course, his presence drawing the attention of nearby candidates who paused their own preparations to watch. His arms crossed over his chest, his expression already set in the lines of someone preparing to witness expected failure. Timer starts when you cross the threshold, Brennan. Monroe positioned herself at the observation point with her stopwatch ready. You've got 90 seconds to complete the course. Most candidates need 3 attempts to reach passing time. Kira crossed the threshold, and the timer started, her body flowing through the obstacles with economy of movement while her mind tracked target zones and threat sectors. The first target appeared as she cleared a wall climb, and her rifle came up smooth and controlled despite her elevated heart rate, the round striking center mass before she'd fully registered the conscious decision to fire. She moved through climbing walls, crawled under wire obstacles, vaulted barriers, each physical challenge immediately followed by target engagement that required instant transition from gross motor activity to fine motor precision. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements efficient, her target acquisition fast enough that she heard Monroe's sharp inhale when the 4th target dropped with a headshot at 25 meters while Kira was still recovering from a roll across rough terrain. The final obstacle was a rope climb followed immediately by 3 targets at different distances and angles. Kira's arms burned as she pulled herself up the 15-foot rope, but her rifle came off her shoulder the instant her boots hit the platform, and the 3 targets dropped in rapid succession before she'd fully caught her breath. Time. Monroe's voice held a note of something that might have been respect, quickly suppressed. 52 seconds. That's the 3rd fastest completion this rotation, and the only one under 60 on a first attempt. The gathered candidates had gone quiet, their previous conversations about her inevitable failure temporarily suspended in the face of performance that didn't match their assumptions. Master Chief Dalton's expression hadn't changed, but his arms had uncrossed, and his clipboard hung at his side, rather than ready to make notations about inadequacy. Kira slung her rifle and moved to the rest area, her body demanding water and recovery while her ears picked up the resumed whispers, the recalculated predictions, the dismissals that now had to account for capability they hadn't expected to witness. She drank deeply from her canteen and prepared for the afternoon's training, knowing that one good performance wouldn't change minds already made up about her limitations. They were waiting for her to fail when the pressure became real, when a surrounded scenario forced her to demonstrate whether her skills would hold under the kind of stress that separated competent operators from truly exceptional ones. She had 4 days until that moment arrived, 4 days of continued doubt and low expectations, for days before she'd show them exactly what she was capable of when everything was on the line. Day 2 began before sunrise, the pre-dawn darkness still clinging to the training grounds when candidates assembled for land navigation exercises. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stood at the briefing point with topographical maps spread across folding tables, his face illuminated by Redland's flashlights that preserved night vision while allowing study of the terrain features they'd be navigating. You'll move through 12 kilometers of varied terrain, hitting 8 checkpoints in sequence. Hayes tapped each marked location on the map with precision. You'll do this alone, with nothing but compass, map, and your ability to read terrain in low-light conditions. Average completion time is 4 hours. Failure to hit all checkpoints in under 6 hours results in course removal. Kira studied her assigned route, memorizing terrain features and potential navigation hazards while around her other candidates did the same. She felt rather than saw Master Chief Dalton move up behind her position, his presence announced by the particular weight of his footsteps and the way conversations nearby dropped in volume. Brennan. His voice carried just loud enough for surrounding candidates to hear clearly. This exercise has eliminated more candidates than any other in Week 1. The terrain includes ridge navigation in darkness, stream crossings without marked paths, and dense forest where visibility drops to less than 10 meters. His pause held the quality of someone waiting for her to acknowledge the out he was offering. You can request alternate training today and attempt this exercise next rotation when you've had more preparation time. She kept her eyes on the map, tracing her route one final time before looking up to meet his gaze directly. I'm ready to proceed now, Master Chief. His expression shifted into something that looked like resignation mixed with the satisfaction of someone who'd correctly predicted an outcome. Your choice. He moved to the next candidate, and Kira caught the exchange of glances between Vickers and Torres, their smirks visible even in the red-tinted darkness. She's not making it past checkpoint 3. Torres spoke just loud enough that his prediction reached her position. The ridge section requires actual land NAV experience, not just classroom theory. She'll spend 2 hours lost, miss the time cutoff, and be gone by lunch. Candidates departed at staggered intervals to prevent following, and Kira's turn came 20 minutes after the first trainee disappeared into the darkness. She moved into the tree line with compass and map secured, her pace steady as she let her eyes adjust fully to the minimal ambient light that filtered through the canopy overhead. The first 3 checkpoints came exactly where the map promised, marked by reflective strips visible only from specific approach angles. She logged each one and continued, her navigation flowing through terrain reading and dead reckoning that accounted for the natural drift that occurred during nighttime movement through unfamiliar ground. The ridge section began at checkpoint 4, a steep climb followed by narrow spine navigation, where a wrong turn would send her into valleys that added hours to the route. Kira studied the terrain features, matched them to her map, and proceeded with the confidence of someone who'd done this exact type of navigation in conditions far worse than a training exercise in North Carolina. She crested the ridge as the first gray light of dawn began softening the darkness, revealing the terrain with increasing clarity that confirmed her navigation had been precise. Checkpoint 5 appeared exactly where it should be, and she continued down the far side of the ridge into the dense forest section that Torres had predicted would defeat her. The forest floor was thick with undergrowth that muffled sound and obscured ground features, but Kira moved through it with steady progress, using terrain association and deliberate pacing to maintain her course despite visibility that dropped to less than 8 meters in the thickest sections. She hit checkpoint 6, then 7, her timing well ahead of the average completion rate that Hayes had mentioned. The final checkpoint required a stream crossing at a point where the water ran swift and waist-deep. The crossing point identifiable only by specific terrain features on both banks. Kira studied the area, identified the correct location, and made the crossing with her gear held high to keep her map and electronics dry. She emerged at the finish point 3 hours and 17 minutes after departing. Her uniform damp from the stream crossing and her boots caked with mud, but her breathing steady and her bearing composed. Sergeant First Class Monroe stood at the checkpoint with her timer and evaluation sheet, and her eyebrows rose slightly when she noted Kira's completion time. 3:17. Monroe marked the sheet with a pen stroke that seemed more emphatic than necessary. That's 43 minutes faster than average, and you're the 4th person to finish out of 17 who've completed so far. She studied Kira with reassessment clear in her expression. Where did you learn to navigate like that? Training, Sergeant. Kira kept her answer simple, offering nothing that would explain capabilities beyond what they'd assumed from standard military schools. Monroe nodded slowly, but her eyes held questions she didn't voice. Report to the equipment shed for dry uniform, then join the others at the morning briefing. The afternoon focus is tactical planning for multiple threat scenarios. The briefing area held a different atmosphere when Kira arrived in her dry uniform an hour later. Candidates who'd finished the land navigation were scattered across the bleachers, some looking exhausted from pushing their limits to make the time cutoff, others appearing fresh from faster completions. Torres and Vickers sat in the middle section, and their conversation paused when they noticed her arrival. She actually finished. Vickers' tone carried disbelief mixed with reluctant acknowledgement, and Monroe said her time was under 3.5 hours. Torres shook his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile observed reality with his predictions. She got lucky with her route. Some terrain is easier to navigate than others, and she probably had better visibility in her sector. Chun, sitting 1 row ahead, turned to face them with his own assessment. I had the same ridge section she did. It's not easier terrain, and visibility was identical since we departed 20 minutes apart. She just navigates better than you expected. The afternoon session focused on tactical planning, with Lieutenant Commander Hayes presenting scenarios that required candidates to develop response strategies for situations involving multiple threats from varied directions. The room arrangement placed candidates in small groups, and Kira found herself assigned with Russo and 2 other trainees named Park and Hendricks. Hayes projected the first scenario on the screen at the front of the room. You're in hostile territory, limited cover. Intelligence indicates 3 to 5 enemy combatants approaching from unknown directions. You have 30 minutes to develop a defensive strategy that maximizes your survival probability while maintaining mission effectiveness. Begin. The groups scattered to their assigned planning areas, and Kira's team gathered around their table with maps and planning materials spread before them. Russo immediately took a position at the head of the table, his body language claiming leadership of the group without discussion. Standard defensive perimeter, 360 coverage, everyone takes a sector. His strategy came out fast, as if he'd already decided before hearing other input. We set up in the best available cover and engage threats as they appear in our designated zones. Kira studied the terrain map, noting features that Russo's rapid assessment had missed. The wind direction matters for sound discipline. If we position here instead, she indicated a location 30 meters from Russo's suggested spot. We have better sight lines to likely approach paths, and the terrain funnels movement into predicted channels. Russo's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing at her contradiction of his plan. That position leaves our 6 exposed to the tree line, only if we assume random approach vectors. Kira kept her tone professional, pointing to specific terrain features. But the dried stream bed creates a natural path that hostile forces will favor because it offers them covered approach. If we position to dominate that stream bed while maintaining observation of the tree line, we control their most likely avenue and maintain awareness of alternatives. Park leaned forward, studying the map with increased interest. She's right. The stream bed is the obvious infiltration route. Any competent enemy force will use it. Russo's expression showed resistance to accepting tactical input from someone he'd already categorized as inadequate. But Park and Hendricks were both nodding, seeing the logic in Kira's assessment. After a moment of tense silence, Russo gave a sharp nod and began modifying the plan to incorporate her suggestions, though his movements carried the frustration of someone forced to acknowledge capability he preferred to dismiss. When the groups presented their strategies to Hayes, he evaluated each one with the critical eye of someone who'd survived real combat by recognizing flawed planning before it could become fatal mistakes. When Kira's group presented, his attention sharpened at their defensive positioning, and he questioned their reasoning for the specific location they'd chosen. Russo explained the streambed logic, carefully avoiding crediting Kira directly for the insight, but Hayes' gaze shifted to her with a look that suggested he recognized exactly where the tactical thinking had originated. After the presentation, he gave a slight nod that might have been approval before moving to evaluate the next group. The day ended with physical training that pushed candidates through exhaustion and into the realm where determination mattered more than conditioning. Kira completed every evolution, matching or exceeding the pace of candidates who outweighed her by 40 pounds, and she noticed Master Chief Dalton watching from the observation point, his expression unreadable, but his attention fixed on her performance in a way that suggested recalculation happening behind his weathered features. 3 days remained until the surrounded scenario. 3 days for doubt to either dissolve or crystallize in a certainty about her limitations. She walked back to the barracks, knowing that her competence in navigation and tactical planning hadn't changed the fundamental assumptions about what she could do when facing real pressure, real threats, real consequences for failure. Day 3 brought the first detailed briefing on the surrounded scenario, the exercise that had been looming over the entire week like a storm building on the horizon. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stood before the assembled candidates with a three-dimensional terrain model that showed the operational area in miniature, complete with elevation changes, vegetation density, and the limited structures that would provide cover options. The surrounded scenario has an average success rate of 19%. Hayes let that number settle over the group before continuing. Success is defined as surviving the engagement while neutralizing at least 60% of hostile forces. Most candidates who fail do so within the first 8 minutes, when the reality of multiple simultaneous threats overwhelms their ability to maintain situational awareness and execute effective countermeasures. He used a pointer to indicate specific terrain features on the model. You'll be inserted here, in this clearing, with basic intelligence suggesting hostile presence in the area, but no specific numbers or positions. Within 2 minutes of insertion, you'll make contact. Within 5 minutes, you'll be engaged from at least 3 directions simultaneously. Your decisions in those first 5 minutes will determine whether you're still functional at the 8-minute mark. Kira studied the terrain model, noting firing lanes, natural choke points, and the way vegetation patterns would affect movement and visibility. Around her, candidates shifted with varying degrees of anxiety, some appearing confident in their abilities while others seemed to be calculating their odds and finding the numbers discouraging. Master Chief Dalton moved to stand beside Hayes, his presence adding weight to the briefing. The surrounded scenario is designed to identify candidates who can operate effectively under conditions that would cause most people to freeze, panic, or make fatal tactical errors. He let his gaze sweep across the assembled group, pausing fractionally longer on Kira than others. Some of you have strong technical skills, good marksmanship, adequate physical conditioning. But this exercise doesn't test those things in isolation. It tests whether you can integrate everything simultaneously while under extreme duress. His attention fixed fully on Kira, his next words clearly directed at her despite addressing the group. The candidates who fail typically do so because they rely on textbook responses rather than adaptive thinking. They execute techniques they've memorized instead of reading the dynamic situation and responding to what's actually happening. The surrounded scenario punishes rigid thinking faster than anything else we do here. Torres leaned toward Vickers, his whisper carrying in the focused silence of the briefing area. That's a problem right there. Everything I've seen from her is by-book execution. When she's got 3 threats, closing from different angles, and limited time to react, she's going to default to training manual responses that won't match the actual tactical picture. Vickers nodded agreement, his expression showing certainty about the prediction. The stress shoot was controlled, single-person exercise on a known course. This is chaos management with lethal consequences for hesitation. Completely different skill set. Hayes continued the briefing, detailing the rules of engagement, ammunition allocation, and the observer protocol that would document every decision and action during the scenario. Medical personnel will be on standby, as injuries during this exercise are common even with safety protocols. You'll be using simulated ammunition, but the physical demands and stress responses are identical to actual combat conditions. He distributed packets containing detailed maps and additional intelligence about the operational area, though he emphasized that conditions on the ground would differ from the briefing materials. Real combat doesn't provide clean intelligence or predictable enemy behavior. This scenario simulates that unpredictability deliberately. The afternoon session moved to scenario rehearsals, walking through various tactical responses to multiple threat situations using the training grounds as a simulation space. Candidates worked in groups, taking turns as the primary operator while others played enemy forces, rotating through different situations to build pattern recognition for threat assessment. Kira found herself grouped with Chun, Park, and a quiet candidate named Alvarez who'd been consistently competent throughout the week without drawing much attention. They cycled through scenarios, and when Kira's turn came as primary operator, she felt the weight of observation from instructors who'd positioned themselves to watch her performance specifically. 3 simulated enemies approached from different vectors, their movements designed to create decision pressure about which threat to engage first. Kira read the terrain, assessed threat priority based on cover positions and firing lanes rather than proximity, and engaged in an order that surprised the observing instructors by targeting the most dangerous position first rather than the closest threat. Monroe called halt after the sequence completed, approaching Kira's position with an expression that mixed evaluation with something that might have been curiosity. Explain your engagement priority. Why did you take the threat at 2 o'clock when the threat at 10 o'clock was 15 meters closer? The threat at 2 had elevation advantage and clear firing lane to my position with no intervening cover. Kira kept her explanation factual, tactical. The closer threat at 10 had to navigate around that equipment barrier, buying me 4 additional seconds before he'd have effective firing position. Those 4 seconds were enough to neutralize the more dangerous threat and reposition before the closer threat cleared his obstacle. Monroe studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly and moving back to the observation point. The exercise continued, but Kira noticed the increased attention from both instructors and fellow candidates, as if her explanation had revealed something they were still trying to process. During the evening briefing, Hayes reviewed common mistakes from the day's rehearsals, projecting tactical diagrams that showed flawed decision trees and the consequences that followed. One diagram showed the exact scenario Kira had just completed, with red lines indicating the standard response pattern that most candidates had demonstrated. 73% of you prioritized the closer threat first. Hayes highlighted the 10 o'clock position that Kira had deliberately delayed engaging. That's instinctive response based on perceived immediate danger. But instinct doesn't account for terrain advantages that make a slightly more distant threat actually more immediately lethal. He switched to a different diagram showing optimal engagement priority. Reading terrain faster than your instincts is what separates adequate operators from exceptional ones. Vickers leaned toward Torres again, though his voice carried more uncertainty than earlier predictions. She made that call. Engage the elevated threat first while everyone else went for the close target. Torres shook his head, resistance clear in his posture. One good call doesn't mean she can handle the real scenario. The surrounded exercise is 30 to 40 minutes of sustained pressure with no breaks, no resets, constantly adapting to new threats and deteriorating tactical positions. It's not about making one smart decision. It's about making 20 consecutive smart decisions while exhausted, stressed, and running on adrenaline. That's the test. Chin spoke quietly from his position one row ahead, having apparently been listening to their ongoing assessment. Whether someone can sustain high-level tactical thinking when everything is falling apart around them. That's what breaks people, not the initial contact, but the sustained chaos that just keeps escalating. The briefing concluded with Hayes announcing the scenario schedule. Tomorrow you'll do final preparation and equipment checks. The surrounded scenario begins at 0600 on day 5. Those of you who succeed will continue to week 2. Those who don't will be released from the course. His gaze swept across the candidates with the weight of someone who'd seen this moment repeated dozens of times. Use tonight to mentally prepare for the most demanding 30 minutes of your military career thus far. Kira returned to the barracks aware that the betting had shifted from whether she'd quit early to whether she'd survive the surrounded scenario. The predictions had become more specific, more detailed in their articulations of where and how she'd fail. Russo had started a pool predicting the minute mark when she'd be eliminated, with most bets clustering between 6 and 12 minutes into the exercise. She checked her equipment methodically, ensuring every piece of gear was exactly where she needed it for immediate access under stress. Her rifle had been cleaned and rechecked multiple times, her magazines loaded and tested, her communication equipment verified functional. She'd studied the terrain model until she could visualize it from any angle, mapped likely enemy approach routes, identified potential defensive positions, and fallback options. 2 days remained until the moment that would either prove her capability beyond question or confirm every doubt that had been expressed since she'd arrived at this course. She lay in her bunk that night, listening to the quiet conversations of other candidates processing their own anxiety about the upcoming test, and she thought about the expression on Master Chief Dalton's face when he'd emphasized that textbook responses wouldn't be enough. He was right about that, at least. Textbook responses were designed for average operators facing standard situations. The surrounded scenario was designed to create chaos that exceeded standard parameters, forcing candidates into the realm where instinct, experience, and adaptive thinking determine outcomes. She had all three, honed under conditions that made this training exercise look controlled and predictable by comparison. They'd find that out soon enough. The betting pools, the predictions of failure, the assumptions about her limitations, all of it would be answered in 30 minutes of sustained combat that would reveal exactly what she was capable of when everything was on the line and there were no second chances for mistakes. Day 4 arrived with heavy cloud cover that promised rain before afternoon, the air thick with moisture that made every movement feel weighted. Final preparation day meant equipment inspections, last-minute briefings, and the kind of nervous energy that pervaded the training grounds as candidates faced the reality that tomorrow would determine whether weeks of effort would culminate in success or elimination. Kira stood at her assigned inspection station while Sergeant First Class Monroe methodically checked every piece of gear, testing magazine springs, verifying communication equipment functionality, ensuring nothing would fail at a critical moment during the surrounded scenario. Monroe's examination was thorough to the point of being invasive, and Kira noticed Master Chief Dalton observing the process from 20 feet away, his attention fixed on her station specifically. "Your gear is squared away." Monroe made notations on her inspection sheet, her pen strokes precise. But gear doesn't win that scenario. Mental preparation and adaptive thinking win it. She looked up from her clipboard, meeting Kira's eyes directly. "I've watched 17 rotations go through this course. The candidates who succeed in the surrounded scenario all have one thing in common. They stop thinking about survival and start thinking about dominating the battle space. The ones who fail are trying not to lose. The ones who succeed are trying to win." "Understood, Sergeant." Kira kept her response simple, offering no elaboration that might reveal more than necessary about her actual experience level. Monroe held her gaze for another moment before moving to the next station. But Kira felt the weight of assessment in that look, as if the instructor was trying to determine which category she'd fall into when pressure mounted and decisions had to be made in seconds rather than minutes. The morning briefing focused on rules of engagement and safety protocols, but Lieutenant Commander Hayes also took time to address the psychological aspects of the exercise. Some of you are going to experience tunnel vision when the shooting starts. Your peripheral awareness will collapse, your fine motor control will degrade, your decision-making will slow down because your brain is processing threat stimulus faster than your conscious mind can articulate responses. He displayed a chart showing physiological stress responses and their impact on combat performance. The candidates who succeed are the ones who've trained through these responses enough times that their body executes correct actions even when their conscious mind is overloaded. Your training has to be deep enough that it becomes automatic, reflexive, something you do without thinking about doing it. Kira listened while around her candidates absorbed this information with varying degrees of confidence. She caught Torres and Vickers in another of their ongoing conversations, their voices low but clear enough in her proximity. That's exactly what's going to break her. Torres gestured vaguely in Kira's direction without looking at her directly. She's got technical skills, I'll give her that. Good marksmanship, solid navigation, decent tactical knowledge. But technical skills fall apart when stress hormones flood your system and you're operating on pure instinct. That's when years of real combat experience make the difference between freezing and flowing. Vickers nodded, his expression thoughtful. She's never been in sustained combat. Everything about her movement patterns, her decision-making, it all shows someone who's trained in controlled environments but never had to execute under actual fire. Tomorrow is going to expose that gap hard. Chun sat one row ahead again, and Kira saw his shoulders tense at their continued assessment, as if he wanted to contradict them, but wasn't certain enough of his own read on her capabilities to speak up. Park, sitting beside Chun, kept his attention forward, but his posture suggested he was listening to the same conversation. The afternoon brought scenario walkthroughs on the actual terrain where the surrounded exercise would occur. Candidates moved through the operational area in small groups, studying cover options, identifying firing lanes, mapping the ground in their minds so that tomorrow's chaos would unfold in semi-familiar space rather than completely unknown territory. Kira's group included Alvarez, Park, and a broad-shouldered candidate named Sutton who'd been quietly competent throughout the week. They walked the terrain methodically, each person noting different tactical features and sharing observations that built a composite understanding of the battle space. This clearing is the insertion point. Park indicated the open area where they'd begin. No cover for the first 10 meters in any direction, which means the initial contact is going to happen while we're maximally exposed. The question is whether we use that exposure to draw contact and identify threat positions, or whether we immediately move to cover and let them dictate the engagement timing. Sutton studied the surrounding tree line and the scattered equipment that provided the only cover in the clearing. If we move immediately to cover, we're reactive. If we use the exposure deliberately to trigger contact on our terms, we control the initial engagement even if it costs us tactical advantage in positioning. Kira walked the perimeter of the clearing, reading terrain with the practiced eye of someone who'd done this evaluation in conditions far more hostile than a training ground in North Carolina. The drainage pattern tells you where they'll position themselves. She pointed to subtle ground contours that most people would miss. Water flows toward these low points, which means over years the vegetation grows denser there. Denser vegetation means better concealment for enemy positions. They'll favor these sectors for their initial setup. Alvarez followed her reasoning, nodding slowly as he traced the drainage lines she'd identified. So we know probable threat positions before contact even occurs. That changes the tactical calculus significantly. They continued the walkthrough, and Kira found herself quietly sharing observations that came from experience none of them could see in her official record. Park and Alvarez absorbed the information readily, asking questions that suggested they recognized the depth of knowledge behind her assessments. Sutton remained more reserved, clearly processing what he was hearing, but not fully committing to trusting it. When the groups reconvened at the command post, Hayes invited questions about the scenario. Most inquiries focused on ammunition allocation, medical evacuation procedures, and the specific criteria that defined success versus failure. Then Russo raised his hand, his expression showing the calculation of someone preparing to make a point. "Sir, how much does prior combat experience correlate with success rates in this scenario?" His question carried implications that everyone in the assembly understood, his gaze flickering briefly toward Kira before returning to Hayes. Hayes considered the question for a moment before answering. Combat experience provides familiarity with stress responses and chaos management that can be advantageous. But this course has seen successful completions from candidates with extensive combat deployments and failures from decorated veterans. The scenario tests specific capabilities that don't always correlate cleanly with deployment history. Some people freeze under this particular type of pressure regardless of their background. He paused, his attention sweeping across the assembled candidates. And some people rise to challenges that exceed anything in their official record. Tomorrow will tell us who's who. Betting on outcomes based on assumptions about experience levels has proven remarkably unreliable in previous rotations. The dismissal felt directed at Russo's question, and Kira noticed several candidates glancing her direction as if reassessing their own predictions about tomorrow's outcome. The betting pool had grown throughout the day, with stakes increasing as candidates committed to their beliefs about who would succeed and who would fail. Evening brought equipment, staging, and final preparations, each candidate organizing gear for immediate access during the early morning insertion. Kira worked methodically, triple-checking every item while around her others engaged in the same ritual preparation that combined practical necessity with psychological comfort. Master Chief Dalton made rounds through the staging area, stopping at each candidate's position for final assessment and last-minute guidance. When he reached Kira's station, he studied her gear layout with the critical eye of someone looking for flaws to exploit. "You've organized for speed over security." His observation carried no judgment, just tactical assessment. Fast access to ammunition and equipment, minimal time required to locate items under stress. That suggests you're planning for high-volume engagement rather than defensive conservation. It's the scenario requirement, Master Chief. Kira kept her tone professional. Surrounded position with multiple threats requires aggressive engagement to reduce enemy numbers faster than they can coordinate effective assault. Defensive conservation extends the engagement duration, which favors the larger force. Dalton's expression shifted fractionally, something that might have been surprise or reassessment crossing his weathered features before settling back into professional neutrality. We'll see if your tactical theory holds up when you're actually executing under pressure. Most candidates who organize for aggressive engagement find themselves overwhelmed within the first 10 minutes because they burn through resources too quickly and leave themselves vulnerable during reload cycles. He moved to the next station, but Kira caught his backward glance. A final assessment that suggested his certainty about her limitations was developing cracks, even if he wasn't ready to acknowledge them openly. She finished her staging and secured her gear, then joined the other candidates for the final briefing that would release them to mental preparation and whatever sleep they could manage before tomorrow's test. Hayes stood before them one last time, his expression showing the weight of someone who'd sent dozens of candidates into this scenario and watched most of them fail. Tomorrow at 0600, you'll discover what you're actually capable of under conditions designed to break most people. Some of you will surprise yourselves. Some will confirm what you already believed about your capabilities. And some will learn that assumptions about limitations, whether your own or others, are often wrong when pressure reveals truth. The candidates dispersed to their barracks, and Kira walked through the humid evening air knowing that every prediction, every doubt, every assumption about her capabilities would be tested in approximately 10 hours. The surrounded scenario would either validate the skepticism that had followed her throughout this week or prove that judgment based on appearances and assumptions was fundamentally flawed when confronted with actual demonstrated capability under maximum stress. 05F30 arrived with darkness still clinging to the training grounds, the promised rain having materialized overnight as a steady drizzle that turned the red clay into slick mud and reduced visibility to the point where headlamps were necessary for movement. Kira dressed in silence, aware of other candidates in the barracks going through their own pre-operation rituals with varying degrees of visible anxiety. The staging area hummed with controlled energy when she arrived, candidates checking gear one final time while instructors conducted last-minute equipment verifications. The rain had lightened to a mist that hung in the air like fog, coating everything with moisture that would make grips slippery and add challenge to already difficult conditions. Lieutenant Commander Hayes stood at the command post with Master Chief Dalton, both men studying tablets that displayed the scenario parameters and monitoring equipment positions. When the candidates assembled, Hayes addressed them with the economical speech of someone who'd given this briefing many times before. The surrounded scenario begins in 15 minutes. You'll be transported to the insertion point individually, with 5-minute intervals between insertions to ensure independent performance without interference from other candidates. Simulated enemy forces are already in position. Your performance will be monitored by observers stationed throughout the operational area, but they will not intervene unless you sustain injury requiring immediate medical attention. He gestured to the transport vehicles waiting in the dim light. Success requires neutralizing at least 60% of hostile forces while maintaining your own operational capability. Average engagement time is 32 minutes for those who complete successfully. Most failures occur between 6 and 14 minutes into the scenario. Questions? The silence held weight, candidates processing final details while managing their own stress responses. Kira noted the way some shifted their weight constantly, burning nervous energy, while others stood with forced stillness that betrayed tension in their locked joints and rigid postures. Brennan, you're third in rotation. Dalton's voice cut through the quiet, his attention fixed on her position. Insertion at 0615. You'll have 3 minutes from vehicle stop to scenario initiation. Use that time for final equipment check and mental preparation. Understood, Master Chief. She kept her acknowledgement brief, professional, offering nothing that would reveal the absolute calm, settling over her like a familiar coat she'd worn in far more dangerous circumstances than this training exercise. The first candidate, Torres, loaded into the transport vehicle with confident movements that suggested he viewed this as validation of capabilities he already knew he possessed. The vehicle departed into the misty darkness, and the remaining candidates settled into waiting with the particular quality of silence that came from people managing their own anxiety while evaluating competitors. Vickers stood near the equipment shed with Russo, their conversation quiet but audible in the pre-dawn stillness. Torres will crush this. He's got 2 combat deployments and multiple hot extractions under his belt. This scenario is designed for operators with his experience level. Russo nodded agreement, but his gaze drifted toward where Kira stood performing a final check of her magazine seating. She's third. We'll know within 20 minutes if she can actually execute under real pressure or if this whole week has been luck and favorable conditions. Chun, standing closer to Kira's position, spoke without turning toward the conversation. You've been predicting her failure since day one. Maybe consider the possibility that you're wrong. The transport vehicle returned empty, and the second candidate, a lean woman named Foster who'd been consistently strong throughout the week, loaded in for her insertion. The vehicle disappeared again into the mist, and Kira used the remaining minutes to center herself completely, letting her breathing settle into the rhythm she'd learned would keep stress hormones manageable and fine motor control intact when violence erupted. Brennan, you're up. Monroe appeared beside the transport vehicle, clipboard in hand and expression neutral. Remember what I told you about dominating rather than surviving. Don't play not to lose. Kira boarded the vehicle and secured herself while the driver navigated the muddy access road toward the operational area. The ride took 4 minutes, each second bringing her closer to the moment that would either prove every doubt wrong or confirm that her capabilities were theoretical rather than practical. The vehicle stopped at the designated insertion point, and the rear door opened to reveal the misty clearing exactly as she'd studied it during yesterday's walkthrough. 3 minutes, Brennan. The driver's voice was professionally detached. Scenario initiates with audible signal. Good luck. She exited the vehicle and moved into the clearing, letting her eyes adjust to the gray pre-dawn light while her mind cataloged terrain features, likely threat positions, and the tactical options available within this specific battle space. The clearing stretched 40 meters across, with tree line on all sides and scattered equipment providing minimal cover options. The drainage patterns she'd identified yesterday were visible as slight depressions in the ground, and she noted the denser vegetation in the predicted sectors. 2 minutes. The announcement came from speakers positioned around the perimeter, countdown to contact that most candidates would spend moving to cover and preparing defensive positions. Kira remained in the center of the clearing, standing upright with her rifle held in low-ready position, her posture deliberately exposed and apparently unconcerned with the vulnerability of her position. To any observer, she looked like someone making a catastrophic tactical error, remaining in maximum exposure rather than seeking cover before contact initiated. 1 minute. She controlled her breathing, let her peripheral awareness expand to its full capacity, and waited with the particular patience of someone who understood that appearing vulnerable was sometimes the fastest way to force an enemy to reveal their positions. The mist swirled around her in the motionless air, visibility perhaps 50 meters in the gray light, and somewhere beyond that limited vision, simulated enemy forces were preparing to initiate contact with a target they assumed would be scrambling for cover. 30 seconds. Kira's fingers rested light on her rifle, her weight balanced and ready for immediate movement in any direction. She'd studied the terrain long enough to know exactly where she'd move when shooting started, which cover would serve her best, which firing lanes would give her greatest advantage. But first she needed them to show her where they were, and the fastest way to make that happen was to give them a target too tempting to resist. Scenario initiated. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then muzzle flashes erupted from 5 positions simultaneously, exactly where the drainage patterns and vegetation density had suggested they'd be. Simulated rounds cracked through the air around her, close enough that most candidates would have been diving for cover in panicked response to the sudden violence. Kira moved, not toward cover, but directly at the nearest threat position, her rifle coming up smooth and controlled while she processed threat priority faster than conscious thought. The enemy at 11 o'clock had elevation advantage from a slight rise in terrain, making him the most dangerous position despite not being the closest threat. Her first 3 rounds took him out of the fight before he could adjust his aim to track her unexpected aggressive movement. She transitioned to the threat at 2 o'clock, engaging while moving laterally across the clearing at an angle that kept her perpendicular to multiple firing lanes rather than presenting a stationary target. 2 rounds center mass, threat neutralized, her body flowing into the next firing position without breaking stride. The remaining 3 enemy positions tried to adjust their fire to track her movement, but she was inside their decision loop now, moving faster than they could coordinate their response. She hit the minimal cover of an equipment barrier and used it for exactly 2 seconds of concealment while she reloaded, her hands executing the magazine change with muscle memory that required zero conscious attention. Back into motion before they could reposition for her static location, she engaged the 8 o'clock threat that had the worst firing angle due to intervening terrain features. 3 rounds, target down, then immediate transition to 10 o'clock where an enemy was trying to flank her previous position. He realized too late that she'd already moved, and her rounds caught him mid-adjustment. The final enemy position at 6 o'clock had better tactical sense than the others, holding fire to avoid revealing his location while she eliminated his teammates. But Kira had marked his probable position during the initial engagement, and she moved directly toward it with aggressive confidence that gave him two choices: engage from suboptimal position or hold fire, and let her close the distance. He chose to engage. His rounds went high and right, stress and surprise degrading his accuracy, just enough that Kira had time to return fire from 15 meters, close enough that her shots couldn't miss even while moving. He went down, and sudden silence fell across the clearing, broken only by her controlled breathing and the soft patter of mist on leaves. Scenario complete. The announcement came from the perimeter speakers. Time elapsed, 6 minutes, 43 seconds. All hostile forces neutralized. Candidate Brennan, hold position for observer assessment. Kira saved her rifle and remained standing in the clearing, her pulse elevated but manageable, her breathing steady, while somewhere in the observation posts, instructors and fellow candidates processed what they'd just witnessed. The transport vehicle arrived to extract her from the operational area, but before she could board, Lieutenant Commander Hayes emerged from the tree line, where he'd been observing from one of the monitoring positions. His expression held something Kira hadn't seen from him before, a combination of intense focus and reassessment that suggested everything he'd assumed about her had just been proven fundamentally wrong. Brennan, hold position. He approached with Monroe, following 3 steps behind, both of them moving with the purposeful stride of people who needed answers immediately. Hayes stopped 5 feet away, his eyes scanning her as if seeing her for the first time. That was not standard advanced tactical operations methodology. That was something else entirely. The scenario required neutralizing 60% of hostile forces, sir. Kira kept her tone professional, factual. I neutralized 100% in under 7 minutes. Hayes' jaw tightened slightly, processing not just what she'd done, but the implications of how she'd done it. You remained exposed in the center of the clearing for the full countdown. That's either catastrophic tactical judgment or you knew exactly what you were doing and why. Which was it? Remaining exposed forced simultaneous engagement from all positions, revealing their locations within the first 3 seconds of contact. Kira met his gaze directly. Once I knew where all 5 threats were positioned, I could prioritize engagement based on actual tactical advantage rather than guessing at probable locations. The apparent vulnerability was deliberate intelligence gathering. Monroe stepped forward, her clipboard forgotten at her side. You moved inside their decision loop. Engaged threats before they could coordinate response to your movement. That's not something we teach in this course. That's advanced special operations doctrine that most candidates wouldn't recognize even if they heard of it. Hayes pulled out his tablet, pulling up the recording of her scenario performance. I watched your entire engagement. Your movement pattern, threat prioritization, the way you used minimal cover for concealment during reload, but never stayed static long enough to become a predictable target. He looked up from the screen. Where did you learn to operate like that? Training, sir. Kira kept her answer simple, offering nothing that would explain the specifics of exactly which training had produced capabilities that exceeded this course's normal parameters. Hayes studied her for a long moment, his expression suggesting he knew she was withholding information but couldn't determine whether to press the issue or accept the answer at face value. He glanced at Monroe, some unspoken communication passing between them before he returned his attention to Kira. You're cleared to return to staging area. But this conversation isn't finished. We're going to have a detailed debrief about your tactical methodology after all candidates complete the scenario. His tone carried the weight of someone who'd recognized that standard operating procedures had just encountered something outside normal boundaries. The transport vehicle delivered her back to the staging area where candidates were waiting for their own insertion times. The moment she stepped out of the vehicle, the assembled group went silent. Torres stood near the equipment shed, his expression showing the particular shock of someone who'd expected to be the performance benchmark and had just watched that assumption demolished. 6 minutes, 43 seconds. Russo's voice broke the silence, reading from a tablet that displayed scenario results. 100% enemy neutralization. 0 injuries sustained. That's faster than the course record by almost 4 minutes. Vickers shook his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile observed reality with everything he'd predicted about her capabilities. I watched the feed. She stood in the open during the countdown. Just stood there like she was waiting for a bus, completely exposed. Then when shooting started, she moved like she had rehearsed that exact scenario 100 times. Chin approached Kira directly, his expression showing the vindication of someone whose assessment had been correct while everyone else had been wrong. That wasn't standard tactics. That was something they'd teach in advanced special operations courses. Where did you actually train before coming here? Before Kira could respond, Master Chief Dalton emerged from the command post, his weathered face showing an expression she hadn't seen from him during the entire week. He moved directly to her position with the purposeful stride of someone who just had his fundamental assumptions about capability challenged. Brennan. His voice carried authority, but also something that might have been respect beginning to emerge from beneath his professional skepticism. I've been running candidates through this course for 7 years. I've seen decorated combat veterans with multiple deployments take 18 minutes to complete that scenario. I've watched special operations candidates with extensive training records take 25 minutes. He paused, letting the weight of those numbers settle. You just completed it in less than 7 minutes using tactical methodology that suggests training well beyond what your service record indicates. My service record is accurate, Master Chief. Kira maintained her professional bearing, while around her, the assembled candidates listened to every word of this exchange. I received training appropriate to my assignments. Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly. Your assignments being what, exactly? Because what I just watched suggests assignments that would require security clearances well above standard military operations. The moment hung in the pre-dawn air, heavy with implication and unspoken questions. Before the conversation could continue, Hayes appeared from the command post and gestured for Dalton to join him. The Master Chief gave Kira a final assessing look before moving to confer with Hayes, leaving her standing in the staging area while other candidates processed what they'd witnessed. Park moved closer, his expression showing the kind of careful reassessment that came from someone who'd been competent enough to recognize true expertise when he saw it. You've done this before. Not this specific scenario, but combat operations at a level most of us haven't experienced. That's not a guess. That's observation from watching you operate. Alvarez joined them, his quiet voice carrying certainty. The way you moved through that scenario, you weren't adapting to conditions. You were executing patterns so ingrained they're automatic. That level of muscle memory comes from extensive real-world application, not classroom training or standard deployment experience. Kira remained silent, aware that anything she said would either reveal more than she intended or require lies that would create additional complications. The scenario results spoke clearly enough without verbal elaboration about her background or training history. The staging area gradually returned to operational focus as additional candidates prepared for their insertions, but the atmosphere had shifted fundamentally. The betting pools had dissolved, the confident predictions of her failure replaced by careful reassessment from people who were recalculating everything they'd assumed about capabilities and limitations based on appearances and official records. Foster, the second candidate, returned from her scenario with completion time of 28 minutes and visible exhaustion from sustained engagement that had pushed her to her limits. She collapsed onto a bench near the equipment shed, accepting water from a nearby candidate while trying to process her own performance against the standard that Kira had just established. Torres prepared for his insertion with movements that had lost some of their earlier confidence, as if knowing that his performance would now be measured against a benchmark that exceeded what he'd anticipated having to match. Vickers helped him with final equipment checks, their conversation too quiet to hear, but their body language suggesting discussion about tactical approaches that might help close the gap between expected performance and the standard that had just been demonstrated. Monroe approached Kira's position with evaluation sheets in hand, her expression showing the professional courtesy that came from recognizing demonstrated competence. You're cleared for the rest of the day. Report to command post at 1300 for tactical debrief with Hayes and Dalton. She paused, her next words carrying weight beyond simple procedural information. They're going to want detailed explanation of your methodology. Be prepared for extensive questioning about your training background. Understood, Sergeant. Kira accepted the information without reaction. Though she knew the debrief would require careful navigation between providing useful tactical information and protecting operational security about training she'd received under circumstances that remain classified. The morning continued with remaining candidates cycling through their scenarios, each one returning with varying degrees of success or failure that would determine whether they continued to week 2 or were released from the course. Kira remained in the staging area, watching the reactions of those who completed successfully and the quiet devastation of those who failed, knowing that her own performance had fundamentally altered the evaluation context for everyone else. By mid-morning, the scenario rotations were complete. 11 candidates had succeeded in neutralizing the required 60% of hostile forces, with completion times ranging from Torres' impressive 14 minutes to Foster's solid 28 minutes. 6 candidates had failed, eliminated before reaching the success threshold, their performance confirming the 81% attrition rate that Hayes had mentioned at the beginning of the week. But none of them had come close to matching Kira's time or methodology, and the gap between her performance and everyone else's created questions that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as favorable conditions or fortunate circumstances. She demonstrated capabilities that exceeded the course parameters, suggesting training and experience that her official record didn't reflect, and now the instructors who'd spent a week doubting her adequacy were confronting the reality that their assumptions had been comprehensively wrong. The command post at 1300 held a different atmosphere than any briefing Kira had attended during her week at the course. Lieutenant Commander Hayes sat behind a field desk with Master Chief Dalton standing beside him, both men studying multiple tablets that displayed her scenario performance from various angles. Sergeant First Class Monroe occupied a chair to the side, her own tablet showing what appeared to be service record documentation. "Brennan, take a seat." Hayes gestured to the single chair position directly across from his desk, the arrangement deliberately formal and creating the impression of an interview rather than a casual discussion. "We've reviewed your scenario performance extensively. We've also pulled your complete service record, training certifications, and deployment history." Kira sat with proper military bearing, her hands resting calmly on her knees while she waited for the questions she knew were coming. The tablets displayed frozen frames from her scenario, showing her exposed position in the clearing, her aggressive movement patterns, her tactical decisions that had impressed observers who'd spent years training special operations candidates. "Your official record shows standard infantry training, deployment to Afghanistan with a logistics unit, assignment to Fort Bragg for administrative duties." Hayes tapped his tablet, bringing up specific documentation. "Nothing in your official record suggests the level of tactical expertise you demonstrated this morning. So I'm going to ask you directly, what training have you received that doesn't appear in these records?" "All my training is documented, sir." Kira kept her response factual, technically accurate. "I received the training appropriate to my assigned duties and clearance level." Dalton leaned forward, his expression showing the frustration of someone who recognized an evasive answer when he heard one. "Lieutenant, I've been in special operations for 23 years. I know what advanced combat tactics look like when I see them executed. What you did this morning wasn't luck or natural talent. That was trained expertise at a level that requires extensive, specialized instruction and real-world application." Monroe interjected before Kira could respond, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone navigating sensitive information. "Her service record shows a 6-month gap 2 years ago. Assignment listed as temporary duty for specialized training, location and details classified above our access level. That gap corresponds with timing that would allow for advanced tactical instruction." Hayes and Dalton exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them that suggested this information aligned with suspicions they'd already developed. Hayes returned his attention to Kira with increased intensity. Were you selected for specialized program training during that 6-month period? He framed the question carefully, recognizing that she might be bound by security restrictions that prevented detailed disclosure. I cannot provide specifics about classified assignments, sir. Kira maintained her professional bearing while delivering the response she'd known would be necessary since the moment her scenario performance exceeded normal parameters. My training record reflects what I'm authorized to discuss. The room fell silent for a moment, all three instructors processing the implications of that statement. Dalton straightened from his leaning position, his expression transforming from frustration to something closer to understanding mixed with renewed respect. So you're telling us, without actually telling us, that you received training from a program we don't have clearance to know about. Hayes made it a statement rather than a question, and that training included tactical methodology well beyond what we teach in this course. Kira remained silent, understanding that her lack of denial served as confirmation while avoiding explicit disclosure of information she couldn't legally share. Hayes nodded slowly, as if her silence answered everything he needed to know. That presents us with an interesting situation, Lieutenant. Monroe leaned forward, her tablet forgotten as she focused entirely on the conversation. You're enrolled in a course designed to identify candidates suitable for advanced tactical operations. But you've just demonstrated capabilities that exceed what we're testing for. That suggests you're either verifying your skills meet our standards or you're here for reasons beyond normal candidate progression. Before Kira could formulate a response that would navigate those implications, the command post door opened and a man in civilian clothes entered with a bearing and presence that marked him as someone with significant authority despite his lack of uniform. He was perhaps 50, with gray threading through dark hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of field operations. Commander Hayes, Master Chief Dalton. The man's voice carried quiet authority that filled the space without volume. I'm here to discuss Lieutenant Brennan's situation. He produced credentials that all three instructors examined carefully before returning them, with visible recognition of the authority they represented. Hayes stood, his posture showing deference to someone operating at a level above his command structure. Sir, we were just discussing Lieutenant Brennan's performance in our surrounded scenario exercise. Her tactical capabilities significantly exceed normal course parameters. The man nodded, as if this information confirmed something he'd already expected. Lieutenant Brennan is here as part of evaluation process for program assignment that remains classified. Her performance in your course provides useful assessment data about how well her training translates to standardized testing environments. He glanced at Kira briefly before returning his attention to the instructors. I apologize that this information couldn't be shared earlier, but operational security requirements prevented disclosure until her capabilities became obviously inconsistent with her cover assignment. Dalton's expression showed the pieces clicking into place, his earlier frustration dissolving into comprehension. So she's been operating undercover as a standard candidate to evaluate whether our course effectively identifies the kind of capabilities she actually possesses. Among other assessment objectives, yes. The man's tone remained professionally neutral. Her scenario performance this morning was exceptional by any standard, which tells us both that her training has been effective and that your course successfully identified advanced capabilities when presented with them, despite initial appearances suggesting otherwise. Monroe shook her head slowly, a slight smile appearing on her face. We spent a week doubting her adequacy because she looked like a standard trainee. Meanwhile, she was evaluating whether we could recognize advanced operator capabilities when they didn't announce themselves obviously. Hayes pulled up his tablet again, studying Kira's scenario footage with new understanding. The way she used apparent vulnerability to gather intelligence about enemy positions, the aggressive movement inside their decision loops, the economy of motion, and perfect threat prioritization. That's not advanced tactical operations methodology. That's something beyond what we teach even in our highest level courses. The civilian man remained silent for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Lieutenant Brennan has received training appropriate to assignments that require capabilities beyond standard special operations parameters. Her presence in your course was designed to answer specific questions about evaluation methodology and capability recognition. Those questions have now been answered. He gestured toward Kira. Lieutenant, you're released from this course effective immediately. Report to Building 7 at 1500 for debrief and next assignment briefing. He returned his attention to the instructors. Her performance record will be documented in your system as successful completion with exceptional marks. Her actual capabilities and assignment details remain classified at levels above your access. The man departed as efficiently as he'd arrived, leaving the three instructors and Kira in silence that felt weighted with implications and recalculations. Hayes was the first to speak, his voice carrying respect that had been absent from every previous interaction. Lieutenant Brennan, I apologize for the skepticism you encountered during your time in this course. We evaluate candidates based on observable performance and apparent experience levels, and we clearly misjudged both in your case. Dalton nodded agreement, his weathered face showing something that might have been chagrin. You spent a week listening to people doubt your capabilities, predict your failure, and assume your limitations based on appearances. That took patience and professionalism beyond what we typically see from operators at any level. The evaluations were useful, Master Chief. Kira stood, recognizing the meeting was concluded. They provided good data about how assumptions affect assessment accuracy and whether genuine capability can be recognized when it contradicts initial judgments. Monroe approached with her hand extended, offering the kind of professional respect that came from someone who'd recognized expertise, even when it was deliberately concealed. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, I suspected by day 3 that you were operating well below your actual capability level. The way you moved, the tactical insights you shared, they all suggested experience far beyond your apparent background. Kira shook her hand, accepting the acknowledgement without elaboration. The course provided valuable assessment of methodology under realistic conditions. Your instruction and evaluation were exactly what the assessment required. She departed the command post and walked across the training grounds toward the barracks to collect her gear, aware that the candidates she'd spent a week training alongside would now be processing the revelation that she'd never been competing against them, but rather evaluating whether the course itself could identify capabilities that deliberately didn't announce themselves through obvious credentials or aggressive displays of expertise. The barracks held only a few candidates when Kira entered to collect her gear, most of them still at afternoon training sessions or equipment maintenance. Torres sat on his bunk, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, and he looked up when she entered, his expression complex with emotions that ranged from residual shock to something that might have been embarrassment. Brennan. He set down his cleaning rod, giving her his full attention in a way he never had during the previous week. Words already spreading about what happened in the command post, about who you actually are and why you were really here. Kira began organizing her personal items into her duffel, keeping her movements efficient and purposeful. I was here to complete an evaluation. That evaluation is now finished. Torres stood and moved closer, his posture showing none of the dismissive confidence he'd carried throughout the week. I spent 5 days betting on when you'd fail. Convinced everyone who'd listened that you didn't have the experience or instincts to handle the surrounded scenario. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I was completely wrong, and I should have known better than to judge capability based on assumptions about background and appearance. You evaluated based on observable information and standard patterns. Kira kept her response professional, offering no judgment of her own about his skepticism. That's reasonable assessment methodology, even when it produces incorrect conclusions. Park entered the barracks with Alvarez, both of them clearly seeking this conversation based on the purposeful way they moved directly to Kira's position. Chen followed moments later, and suddenly she was surrounded by candidates who'd spent a week forming opinions about her limitations. We heard you're some kind of special program operator. Park's voice carried the careful respect of someone who'd recognized expertise when others had missed it. that your training is classified at levels above what gets discussed in normal military contexts. I can't discuss specifics about my training or assignments. Kira continued packing while addressing their implicit questions. What I can say is that this course provided useful assessment data about evaluation methodology and capability recognition under realistic conditions. Alvarez leaned against the nearby bunk frame, his quiet voice holding the weight of someone who'd been processing implications carefully. You let us underestimate you for an entire week. Listen to predictions about your failure. Watch people bet on when you'd quit. Absorbed all that skepticism without ever correcting the assumptions or defending your actual capabilities. The assessment required authentic conditions. Kira secured her duffel and turned to face them directly. If I'd announced advanced training or demonstrated full capabilities from the start, the evaluation would have measured how people respond to obvious expertise. The goal was to measure whether genuine capability can be recognized when it contradicts initial assumptions and doesn't announce itself through credentials. Chin nodded slowly, understanding crossing his features. So every time Vickers or Torres or Russo predicted your failure, every time Dalton offered you an exit from difficult exercises, every time people expressed doubt about your adequacy, you were gathering data about how judgment affects assessment accuracy. And every time I demonstrated competence that surprised observers, the course was proving it could identify capability even when that capability didn't match expected patterns. Kira shouldered her duffel. The surrounded scenario was designed to reveal true operational capacity under pressure. It did exactly that, which validates the course methodology even though the instructors didn't initially recognize what they were seeing. Vickers appeared in the doorway with Russo, both of them showing the particular discomfort of people who'd been vocally wrong about fundamental assessments. Vickers approached first, his usual confident bearing replaced with something closer to contrition. Lieutenant Brennan. The use of her rank rather than surname marked the shift in how he viewed her. I owe you an apology. I spent the entire week convinced you were out of your depth, telling anyone who'd listen that you'd fail when pressure mounted. He gestured helplessly. I was measuring you against my own experience and capabilities, assuming that because you didn't look or act like operators I'd known, you couldn't possibly perform at that level. Russo stepped forward, his compact frame showing tension in every line. I started a betting pool about what minute you'd be eliminated during the surrounded scenario. Had people wagering money on your failure based on my certainty that you couldn't handle the pressure. That was unprofessional and showed judgment so flawed, it's embarrassing to acknowledge. You both evaluated based on pattern recognition from your experience. Kira's tone remained neutral, offering neither absolution nor condemnation. The assessment was specifically designed to test whether those evaluation patterns could be overcome when confronted with performance data that contradicted initial assumptions. Your responses provided valuable information about how strongly preconceptions influence ongoing assessment, even when evidence suggests those preconceptions are wrong. Torres moved to join the group, creating a semicircle of candidates who'd spent a week convinced of conclusions that had proven comprehensively incorrect. We all failed a test we didn't know we were taking. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd recognized a deeper lesson in the week's events. You weren't just completing training exercises. You were measuring whether we could recognize excellence when it didn't announce itself through obvious markers like rank, combat patches, or aggressive displays of expertise. The course design assumes capability correlates with certain observable characteristics and background indicators. Kira adjusted her duffel strap, preparing to depart. That assumption works most of the time, but it also creates systematic bias that can cause evaluators to miss genuine capability when it appears in unexpected forms. This assessment measured how strong that bias is and whether course methodology can overcome it. Monroe appeared in the barracks doorway, her presence drawing immediate attention from the assembled candidates. Lieutenant Brennan, your transport to Building 7 departs in 10 minutes. She glanced at the gathered group with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what conversation had been happening. Gentlemen, Lieutenant Brennan has provided you with a masterclass in humility and accurate assessment. I suggest you internalize those lessons thoroughly. The candidates stepped back, creating space for Kira to move toward the exit. She paused at the door, turning to address them one final time with words that carried both professional courtesy and underlying message about the week's true purpose. You'll all continue through this course, and potentially into advanced operations assignments. When you're evaluating teammates, subordinates, or candidates in the future, remember that capability doesn't always look the way you expect it to look. The most dangerous operators are often the ones who don't need to announce their expertise because they're confident enough to let their performance speak for itself. Don't mistake quiet competence for inadequacy, and don't confuse lack of credentials with lack of capability. She departed the barracks and walked across the training grounds one final time, aware of the transformed atmosphere from when she'd arrived 5 days earlier. Then she'd been subjected to dismissive skepticism, low expectations, and confident predictions of failure. Now she left behind candidates and instructors who'd learned that judgment based on appearances and assumptions was fundamentally unreliable when confronted with actual demonstrated capability under pressure. The transport vehicle waited at the designated pickup point, and Kira loaded her gear before settling into the seat for the drive to Building 7 and whatever debrief awaited her there. Through the window, she watched the training grounds recede, the obstacle courses and ranges, and the clearing where she'd demonstrated capabilities that shattered every assumption people had made about her limitations. The assessment had been successful by every measurable parameter. The course had eventually recognized advanced capability despite initial skepticism, proving that its evaluation methodology could overcome bias when presented with sufficient performance evidence. The instructors had acknowledged their misjudgments and shown capacity for reassessment when confronted with data that contradicted their preconceptions. And the candidates had received a lesson about accurate evaluation that no classroom instruction could have provided as effectively. But beneath the successful assessment metrics, Kira recognized a deeper truth about military culture and human nature that the week had illuminated clearly. People created narratives about capability based on limited information and pattern recognition, then filtered all subsequent observations through those initial narratives. Breaking through those established narratives required performance so exceptional it couldn't be dismissed or explained away through favorable circumstances. She provided that exceptional performance in the surrounded scenario, demonstrating tactics and execution that exceeded course parameters by such significant margins that even the most skeptical observers had to acknowledge their assumptions had been wrong. The 6 minutes and 43 seconds it had taken to neutralize all enemy forces represented not just successful completion of a training exercise, but comprehensive proof that quiet competence could match or exceed aggressive displays of expertise. The vehicle navigated through Fort Bragg's complex road system toward Building 7, and Kira used the transit time to mentally prepare for the debrief that would analyze every aspect of the week's assessment. She'd provide detailed observations about course methodology, instructor evaluation patterns, candidate responses to unexpected capability, and the effectiveness of using undercover assessment to measure how well standard training programs identified genuine expertise. The data would inform future program development and evaluation protocols, helping ensure that advanced capability could be recognized regardless of how it presented itself. The week of absorbed skepticism and dismissed competence would translate into improved assessment methodology that served operators who followed, making the patience required to endure constant doubt worthwhile in service of larger program objectives. Building 7 appeared ahead, its nondescript exterior concealing the specialized program offices that coordinated assignments requiring capabilities beyond standard military parameters. Kira prepared to transition from the assessment role she'd played for the past week back into her actual operational identity, ready to apply the lessons learned about capability recognition and evaluation accuracy to whatever mission requirements came next. Building 7's interior matched its unremarkable exterior, deliberately designed to blend into Fort Bragg's landscape of administrative structures while concealing the specialized operations coordinated within its walls. Kira passed through security checkpoints that verified her clearance level and identity before an escort guided her through corridors that held the quiet efficiency of spaces where serious work happened without fanfare or unnecessary display. The debrief room held a conference table surrounded by 6 chairs, with secure communication equipment built into the walls and display screens positioned for optimal viewing from any seat. The civilian man who'd appeared at the command post earlier sat at the head of the table with 2 other individuals whose bearing marked them as senior program personnel despite their lack of identifying insignia or name tags. "Lieutenant Brennan, please be seated." The civilian gestured to a chair position where all 3 evaluators could observe her directly. "I'm Director Kellerman. This is Deputy Director Chun and Operations Coordinator Vasquez. We've been monitoring your assessment throughout the week, and we have extensive questions about your observations and conclusions." Kira settled into the indicated chair, her posture professional and her mind organizing the week's data into reportable format. "The assessment objectives were successfully accomplished, sir. The Advanced Tactical Operations course demonstrated capacity to identify genuine capability even when that capability contradicted initial assumptions based on appearance and credentials." Deputy Director Chun, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, pulled up a tablet displaying scenario footage. "Let's discuss the surrounded exercise specifically. You completed in 6 minutes 43 seconds using methodology that exceeded course parameters significantly. Walk us through your tactical decision-making and explain why you chose approaches that differed from standard doctrine." Kira oriented herself to the frozen image on screen, showing her exposed position in the clearing during the countdown phase. Standard doctrine prioritizes cover and defensive positioning when facing unknown enemy strength and positions. I assessed that gathering intelligence about actual threat locations was more valuable than immediate cover, because accurate threat information enables more efficient engagement prioritization. You deliberately made yourself a target to force enemy revelation. Vasquez leaned forward, his weathered features showing the interest of someone who'd conducted similar operations under real-world conditions. That requires absolute confidence in your ability to process multiple simultaneous threats and engage faster than they can coordinate effective response. Where does that confidence come from? Training repetition under conditions that exceeded this scenario's stress parameters. Kira kept her explanation factual. The surrounded exercise presented 5 threats with predictable positioning based on terrain features. Actual operations have involved up to 12 simultaneous threats in urban terrain with civilians present and political constraints on engagement parameters. By comparison, this scenario was controlled and manageable. Kellerman made notes on his tablet, his expression showing the kind of assessment that measured responses for both content and delivery. Your performance created significant impact on course instructors and fellow candidates. Master Chief Dalton, who has 23 years of special operations experience, stated that your tactical execution exceeded anything he'd observed in 7 years of running that course. How do you assess the value of creating that level of impact during an undercover evaluation? The impact served assessment objectives by forcing evaluators to confront the gap between their assumptions and observed reality. Kira referenced her own mental notes from the week's observations. Initial skepticism was strong enough that incremental competence demonstrations were dismissed as luck or favorable conditions. Only performance that exceeded parameters by unmistakable margins could overcome established bias. The surrounded scenario provided that margin. Chin pulled up additional footage showing various interactions throughout the week, pausing on moments where skepticism had been most openly expressed. You absorbed significant dismissal and doubt throughout the assessment period. Betting pools on your failure, verbal predictions of inadequacy, authority figures offering exits from difficult exercises. How did sustained skepticism affect your operational effectiveness or psychological state? It provided useful data about how doubt affects motivation and performance in operators who don't have the confidence to ignore external assessment. Kira considered her phrasing carefully. For operators with established self-knowledge about their capabilities, external skepticism is simply noise that provides information about evaluator bias rather than actual capability. But for less experienced personnel, sustained doubt can become internalized and affect performance outcomes. Understanding that dynamic helps inform how we structure evaluation environments for optimal assessment accuracy. Vasquez nodded slowly, appreciation showing in his expression. You're saying the skepticism didn't affect you because you knew what you were capable of regardless of what others believed. But you recognized that same skepticism would undermine less confident operators, which means evaluation methodology needs to account for how much external judgment influences performance. Correct. Kira confirmed his assessment. The Advanced Tactical Operations course currently assumes that genuine capability will emerge regardless of evaluator expectations. This assessment suggests that assumption may be flawed for operators who haven't yet developed psychological resilience against systematic doubt. Early identification and support for those operators could improve success rates. Kellerman made additional notes before pulling up a different set of data showing performance metrics from throughout the week. Your land navigation completion was 43 minutes faster than course average. Your stress shoot was third fastest on record. Your tactical planning contributions were noted by instructors as exceeding standard candidate insight. Yet none of those demonstrations significantly changed initial skepticism about your capabilities. Why? Pattern recognition bias. Kira had analyzed this question extensively during the week. Evaluators form initial assessments based on available information and observable characteristics. Once those assessments are established, subsequent data gets filtered through existing beliefs. Individual demonstrations of competence can be explained away as luck, favorable conditions, or isolated skill areas that don't represent overall capability. Only performance that exceeds explanation capacity forces reassessment of fundamental assumptions. Chen leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes showing the engagement of someone processing implications beyond immediate conversation. So you're recommending that evaluation methodology needs to account for confirmation bias more explicitly, that we need structured protocols forcing evaluators to question their initial assumptions at regular intervals rather than allowing those assumptions to filter all subsequent observation. That would improve assessment accuracy. Yes. Kira confirmed the inference. Additionally, creating evaluation environments where initial information is deliberately misleading or incomplete could help identify evaluators who can recognize capability despite contrary indicators. Those evaluators would be valuable for talent identification in unconventional recruitment contexts. Vasquez pulled up scenario footage again, this time showing the moment when she'd engaged the first threat while moving directly toward enemy position rather than seeking cover. This moment specifically, you moved toward threat rather than away, engaging while advancing into danger zone. That's counterintuitive to most training doctrine. Explain the tactical calculus that made that the correct decision. The threat at 11 o'clock had elevation advantage that made him most dangerous regardless of range. Kira walked through the decision tree that had processed in milliseconds during actual execution. Delaying engagement to reach cover would have given him additional seconds with optimal firing position. Moving toward him while engaging collapsed his decision loop because forward movement was an anticipated response. His adjustment time exceeded my engagement time, resulting in threat neutralization before he could coordinate with other positions. And you processed all that tactical analysis in the 2 seconds between scenario initiation and engagement. Kellerman's statement carried implications about cognitive processing speed under stress. That level of rapid tactical assessment suggests training that goes beyond standard special operations curriculum. Kira remained silent, recognizing the statement didn't require verbal response while understanding that her silence confirmed what Kellerman had already concluded from her performance data. The room held quiet for a moment while all three evaluators made notes and reviewed additional information on their tablets. Deputy Director Chun was the first to speak again, her tone shifting from analytical to evaluative. Lieutenant Brennan, your assessment performance exceeded all expectations and provided valuable data about evaluation methodology and capability recognition. Based on this successful completion, you're being recommended for advancement to the next phase of program development. That phase will involve operational assignments requiring capabilities you demonstrated this week, with additional specialized training to refine specific skill areas. The training will take place at a facility outside normal military structure, with classification levels that require additional security clearances and non-disclosure agreements beyond what you've already signed. Vasquez pulled up documents on the display screen. You'll have 48 hours to complete necessary administrative requirements and prepare for transport to the training facility. Questions? Kira reviewed the displayed information quickly, noting details about location, duration, and general parameters while recognizing that specifics would be provided after arrival. No questions at this time, sir. Kellerman stood, signaling the debrief's conclusion. Excellent work this week, Lieutenant. You've proven that quiet competence can be as effective as aggressive displays of expertise, and you provided data that will improve how we identify and evaluate talent across multiple programs. Your next assignment will build on these capabilities in operational contexts that require even higher levels of performance under pressure. The three evaluators departed, leaving Kira alone in the conference room with instructions to report to administrative processing within the hour. She sat for a moment in the quiet space, mentally transitioning from the assessment role she'd played for the past week in a preparation for whatever challenges the next phase would present. The administrative processing took most of the afternoon, security clearances verified and enhanced, non-disclosure agreements signed with legal weight that extended beyond standard military confidentiality requirements, medical evaluations updated to reflect current operational readiness. Kira moved through each station with efficient professionalism while her mind began preparing for the transition from evaluation role to actual operational assignment. By 1700, she'd completed all required processing and returned to temporary quarters to organize her gear and personal effects for transport the following morning. The quarters held the sterile functionality of spaces designed for transient personnel, nothing personalized or permanent, just essential furniture and the quiet that came from being isolated from normal base activity. A knock on the door interrupted her packing, and she opened it to find Lieutenant Commander Hayes standing in the corridor with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with something that might have been personal interest in the conversation he'd come to have. Lieutenant Brennan. He gestured toward the small seating area inside the quarters. Do you have a few minutes for an unofficial conversation? Nothing that needs to be documented or reported, just a discussion between operators about the week's events and their implications. Of course, sir. Kira stepped aside to allow him entry, gesturing to the available seating while she took a position on the desk chair facing him. What can I help you with? Hayes settled into the chair with the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades in physically demanding service and carried the accumulated where that came with it. I've been running the Advanced Tactical Operations course for 4 years. Before that, I spent 18 years in SEAL teams, including command of a Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan. He paused, his gaze direct and assessing. In all that time, I've never encountered an operator with your particular combination of capabilities. The assessment required authentic performance under realistic conditions. Kira kept her response measured, uncertain where Hayes was directing this conversation. I demonstrated what was necessary to fulfill evaluation objectives. You demonstrated capabilities that exceed what most special operations personnel achieve after years of combat experience and advanced training. Hayes leaned forward slightly, his intensity increasing. The way you read terrain, processed multiple simultaneous threats, executed tactical decisions faster than conscious thought should allow. That's not just training and experience. That's something else, something that suggests either natural aptitude at exceptional levels or training methodology we don't currently understand. I received appropriate training for my assignments. Kira maintained the careful boundary around classified information while acknowledging his observations. The specifics of that training remain restricted, but I can confirm it was comprehensive and focused on scenarios similar to what your course presented. Hayes nodded slowly, as if her evasive answer confirmed suspicions he'd already developed. I did some research after this morning's events, called in favors with people who have higher clearances than I do, asked careful questions about programs that might produce operators with your demonstrated capabilities. He held her gaze steadily. The answers I received were mostly non-answers, which told me more than explicit information would have. You're part of something that operates well above standard special operations parameters. The silence hung between them for a moment, Kira recognizing that Hayes had pushed against classification boundaries to satisfy his professional curiosity about what he'd witnessed. She chose her words with precision that acknowledged his insight without confirming specific details. There are programs within military structure that address operational requirements beyond standard parameters. Those programs require capabilities that standard training doesn't develop. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics, but I can confirm that such programs exist and that selection for them involves extensive evaluation of both physical capabilities and psychological suitability for operations that most personnel never encounter. Hayes absorbed this carefully worded response, his expression showing understanding that she'd given him as much confirmation as classification allowed. The week you spend in my course, absorbing doubt and skepticism while evaluating our methodology, that took discipline beyond what most operators possess. Most people with your capabilities would have been frustrated by the constant underestimation, irritated by the betting pools and predictions of failure. The skepticism provided useful assessment data. Kira considered how much professional insight she could share without crossing security boundaries. Understanding how evaluators form judgments and how strongly those judgments resist contradictory evidence helps improve talent identification across all programs. The patience required to gather that data is part of operational discipline necessary for assignments that require sustained cover maintenance under difficult conditions, which suggests your actual operational role involves more than direct action combat. Hayes made it a statement rather than question, clearly assembling a picture from available fragments. You're trained for operations that require blending into environments while maintaining advanced capability that can't be revealed until strategically necessary. Kira offered neither confirmation nor denial, simply maintaining professional silence that Hayes interpreted correctly as indication he'd reached classification limits. He nodded acceptance and shifted his approach slightly. Regardless of what you can or cannot discuss about your training and assignments, I want you to know that this week changed how I think about evaluation methodology and capability recognition. Master Chief Dalton and I spent 2 hours this afternoon discussing how we can modify our assessment protocols to better identify capability that doesn't announce itself through obvious markers. Your presence forced us to confront our own biases in ways that years of standard operations never accomplished. That outcome serves program objectives well. Kira allowed herself slight relaxation of professional formality, recognizing Hayes' genuine interest in improving evaluation methodology. Accurate talent identification becomes increasingly important as operational requirements evolve beyond parameters that standard training addresses. Courses like yours serve as critical filters for advanced program selection, but only if evaluation methodology can recognize capability regardless of how it presents itself. Hayes stood, preparing to depart, but clearly having accomplished whatever purpose had brought him to this conversation. One final question, if you're willing to address it. The surrounded scenario completion time of 6 minutes, 43 seconds. How does that compare to your performance in actual operational contexts? Better, worse, or roughly equivalent? Kira considered the question carefully, weighing what information she could share against what needed to remain classified. The scenario provided controlled environment with known parameters and safety protocols. Actual operations involve variables that make direct comparison difficult. But if I'm being honest, the scenario was less challenging than most operational contexts I've encountered. The threat density was lower, the rules of engagement were clearer, and the consequences for failure were significantly reduced. Hayes absorbed this answer with the expression of someone who just had suspicions confirmed about capability levels he'd only theorized existed. He moved toward the door, then paused for final observation. Lieutenant Brennan, whatever operations you're assigned to in the future, whoever you're working with or against, I'm confident you'll execute with the same excellence you demonstrated this week. And I'm grateful that you're on our side, because facing an operator with your capabilities would be a deeply concerning prospect. He departed, leaving Kira alone with the recognition that her assessment had impacted more than just methodology evaluation. She'd forced experienced special operations personnel to reassess their understanding of human capability limits and acknowledge that training and talent could produce performance levels they hadn't previously encountered. The evening settled over Fort Bragg with the particular quiet that came after intense activity concluded, and Kira continued her packing while mentally preparing for transport to the next training facility. The week's assessment had been successful by every measurable parameter, providing valuable data about evaluation methodology while simultaneously proving that quiet competence could achieve objectives as effectively as aggressive displays of expertise. But beyond the assessment metrics and program objectives, the week had also demonstrated something about human nature and institutional culture that would inform how she approached future operations. People created narratives about capability based on limited information, then defended those narratives even when evidence suggested they were wrong. Breaking through established narratives required performance so exceptional it couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She provided that exceptional performance in the surrounded scenario, using 6 minutes and 43 seconds to demolish every assumption that had been made about her limitations. The shock on observers' faces when she'd completed the scenario, the silence that had followed her performance, the rapid reassessment from people who'd spent days confidently predicting her failure, all of it confirmed that demonstrated capability under pressure remained the most effective method for overcoming bias and establishing credibility. Tomorrow she'd transport to the next phase of program development, whatever that entailed, carrying lessons learned from this week's assessment into operational contexts that would require capabilities she'd only partially demonstrated during the course evaluation. The surrounded scenario had tested whether she could operate effectively under controlled stress with known parameters. The actual operations waiting in her future would test whether those same capabilities held up under real-world chaos with variables that couldn't be predicted or controlled against adversaries who wouldn't follow scenario protocols or observe safety restrictions, in contexts where failure meant consequences far more serious than course elimination. She'd proven this week that she could dominate battle space when conditions favored preparation and tactical advantage. The next phase would determine whether that dominance extended to operations where preparation was incomplete, advantages were marginal, and success required adapting to circumstances that exceeded even advanced training parameters. Kira finished packing and secured her gear, then spent the remaining evening hours in physical and mental preparation for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. The week at Advanced Tactical Operations course represented one completed milestone in a career that would include many more, each one testing different aspects of capability and resilience under increasingly demanding conditions. She'd passed this milestone with performance that exceeded expectations and transformed how experienced operators thought about capability recognition. The next milestone waited somewhere beyond Fort Bragg's boundaries, in facilities and operations that required security clearances above standard access levels, and she prepared to meet it with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through a week of absorbed skepticism and demonstrated excellence when stakes demanded proof beyond doubt. Morning arrived with clear skies that promised heat later, but held comfortable coolness in the early hours when Kira loaded her gear into the transport vehicle that would take her to the airfield. The base was already active with training rotations and operational preparations, The familiar rhythm of military life, continuing regardless of individual departures or arrivals. She made one final stop at the Advanced Tactical Operations course area, finding Master Chief Dalton conducting morning inspection of candidates who'd survived the surrounded scenario and were preparing for Week 2 training. He noticed her approach and stepped away from the formation, gesturing for her to walk with him toward the equipment sheds where they could speak without being overheard. Lieutenant Brennan, his weathered face showed the kind of respect that came from someone who'd recognized expertise after initially missing it. I wanted to speak with you before you departed. What happened this week, what you demonstrated, and what we learned from it, that's going to change how we evaluate candidates going forward. They walked in silence for a few steps before he continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone processing significant professional reassessment. I've been in special operations for 23 years. I thought I understood the full spectrum of human capability in tactical operations. Then I watched you complete that surrounded scenario in less than 7 minutes using methodology I'd never seen executed at that level of perfection, and I realized my understanding was incomplete. The course methodology is sound, Master Chief. Kira kept her tone professional, but allowed acknowledgement of his insight. The scenario design effectively identifies capability under pressure. The evaluation protocols just needed refinement to account for how initial assumptions can filter observation of genuine skill. Dalton stopped walking and turned to face her directly, his expression serious and thoughtful. For 7 years, I've been the final authority on who passes and who fails this course. I've eliminated candidates I thought were inadequate and advanced others I believed were qualified. Now I'm questioning how many times my initial judgment about someone was wrong, how many capable operators I might have eliminated because they didn't match my expectations about what expertise should look like. That awareness will make you a better evaluator going forward. Kira offered the observation without judgment. Recognition of bias is the first step toward overcoming it. The candidates who benefit from your refined methodology will have you to thank for more accurate assessment. He nodded slowly, absorbing the perspective she offered. Can I ask you one question that's been bothering me since yesterday? When you stood exposed in that clearing during the countdown, were you absolutely certain you could process and engage 5 simultaneous threats before they could coordinate effective response? Or was there doubt that you managed despite the risk? Kira considered her answer carefully, recognizing the importance of honest response to someone genuinely seeking to understand exceptional performance. There's always tactical uncertainty in combat operations. Variables you can't control, capabilities you can't perfectly predict. But I'd executed similar scenarios under more difficult conditions enough times that I could calculate probability of success with reasonable accuracy. The confidence came from knowing my actual capability level rather than hoping I was adequate. That's what separates truly exceptional operators from merely competent ones. Dalton's voice carried the recognition of someone who'd just articulated something he'd always sensed but never clearly defined. Exceptional operators know their limits precisely because they've tested them repeatedly under real pressure. Competent operators believe they know their limits, but haven't actually verified them against maximum stress conditions. They resumed walking, and Dalton continued his reflection. The candidates I'm training this rotation will benefit from what you taught me this week. I'm going to be more careful about initial judgments, more willing to let performance data override my assumptions, more aware that capability can look different than I expect while still being genuine and exceptional. That outcome serves both the candidates and the broader military mission. Kira appreciated his willingness to acknowledge and learn from the week's events. Accurate talent identification at every level improves operational effectiveness across all programs. They reached the equipment shed, and Dalton extended his hand with a formal gesture of professional respect between operators. Lieutenant Brennan, whatever operations you're assigned to, I'm confident you'll execute with excellence. And I'm grateful for the professional lesson you provided this week, even though receiving it required acknowledging how wrong my initial assessment was. Kira shook his hand firmly. Master Chief, Your willingness to reassess and adapt demonstrates leadership that will benefit every candidate who trains under your instruction. That's valuable contribution to mission success that extends far beyond any individual assessment. She departed the training area and returned to the waiting transport vehicle, aware that behind her, the Advanced Tactical Operations course would continue with refined evaluation methodology that accounted for lessons learned from her week-long assessment. The candidates beginning week 2 would never know that their training had been influenced by an operator who'd spent 5 days being underestimated before demonstrating capabilities that forced comprehensive reassessment of evaluation protocols. The drive to the airfield took 20 minutes through Fort Bragg's sprawling complex, past ranges and training areas where future operators were developing skills that might eventually lead them to programs like the one Kira was advancing into. The aircraft waiting at the military terminal was unmarked, its civilian appearance concealing its military purpose and the classified nature of personnel it transported. Director Kellerman waited near the aircraft with the same quiet authority he'd demonstrated throughout the assessment process. "Lieutenant Brennan, your transport is ready. The facility you're heading to represents the next level of program development. The training there will build on capabilities you've already demonstrated while developing new skills required for operations beyond standard special operations parameters." He handed her a sealed folder marked with classification indicators that exceeded standard military security levels. "Mission briefing materials for review during flight. Your arrival schedule and initial training objectives are outlined there, along with administrative details about the facility and program structure." Kira accepted the folder and secured it in her carry bag. "Thank you, sir. I'm prepared to begin immediately upon arrival." Kellerman nodded, then added one final observation before she boarded. "This week you proved that exceptional capability can exist without announcing itself through obvious markers. That's a valuable lesson for talent identification across all programs. But it's also a reminder about operational security and the importance of knowing when to reveal capability and when to keep it concealed. The next phase will require even more sophisticated judgment about those decisions." "Understood, sir." Kira recognized the layered meaning in his words, acknowledging both the assessment success and the operational principle it had demonstrated about strategic capability revelation. She boarded the aircraft and found seating in the sparse interior configured for military transport rather than civilian comfort. As the aircraft lifted off and Fort Bragg fell away beneath her, Kira reflected on the week that had just concluded and the lessons it had provided about human nature, institutional bias, and the power of demonstrated capability to overcome established assumptions. She'd arrived at the Advanced Tactical Operations course as an unknown candidate with official record that suggested standard background and capabilities. She'd spent 5 days absorbing skepticism and doubt while deliberately performing below her actual capability level to gather assessment data about evaluation methodology. Then she demonstrated expertise that exceeded course parameters by margins impossible to dismiss or explain away, forcing comprehensive reassessment from everyone who'd predicted her failure. The week had proven multiple critical points about talent identification and evaluation accuracy. Initial judgments based on limited information and observable characteristics were unreliable predictors of actual capability. Sustained skepticism could be overcome by performance that exceeded explanation capacity, and quiet competence could achieve objectives as effectively as aggressive displays of expertise while providing strategic advantages that came from being underestimated until demonstration became necessary. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below and let us know what part stood out most. Maybe it was Kira's patience under constant doubt, the shock when she dominated the surrounded scenario, or the lessons about capability recognition that emerged from the assessment. Or perhaps you've experienced similar situations where someone's true abilities were underestimated until pressure revealed the truth. We'd love to hear your thoughts and any personal connections you have to themes of quiet competence proving itself when stakes are highest. Those lessons would inform every operation in her future, Every interaction with teammates and adversaries, every decision about when to reveal capability and when to keep it concealed for strategic advantage. The surrounded scenario had been one test among many she'd faced throughout her career, significant because it had served dual purpose of assessment validation and capability demonstration, but ultimately just another milestone in ongoing development toward operational excellence. The aircraft climbed to cruising altitude and settled in a steady flight toward whatever facility waited at the destination coordinates. Kira opened the sealed folder and began reviewing mission briefing materials that outlined training objectives requiring capabilities she'd only partially demonstrated during the assessment week. The next phase would push her further, testing whether her performance under controlled conditions translated to operational context with variables that couldn't be predicted or managed. She'd proven this week that she could dominate when conditions favored preparation and tactical advantage. The training ahead would determine whether that dominance extended to chaos that exceeded preparation parameters, to adversaries who operated at capability levels matching or exceeding her own, to contexts where success required adaptation beyond anything current training had addressed. But for now, in the quiet hours of flight between completed milestone and upcoming challenges, Kira allowed her self-acknowledgement of what the week at Advanced Tactical Operations course had accomplished. She'd fulfilled assessment objectives, provided valuable data about evaluation methodology, forced experienced operators to reassess their understanding of capability recognition, and demonstrated that quiet competence could achieve exceptional outcomes when judgment and doubt created conditions that made revelation strategically valuable. The aircraft continued its flight toward destinations and training that remained classified above standard access levels, carrying an operator who'd just proven that assumptions about limitations were often wrong when pressure revealed truth, and that the most dangerous capabilities were frequently the ones that didn't announce themselves until demonstration became necessary for mission success. The week behind her represented one completed chapter in a career that would include many more, each one testing different aspects of skill and resilience under increasingly demanding conditions that separated adequate operators from truly exceptional ones who could execute beyond perceived limits when circumstances required impossible performance.